Well, Libvirt's used by a lot of open source virtualization apps. Virt Manager, Virt Viewer, several installers, VM install, Virt install, management solutions like Overt, IaaS solutions like Eucalyptus and OpenStack, a whole host of apps which are all on the Libvirt website there. They use Libvirt, and so if your hypervisor is supported in Libvirt right away, you are a bigger part of the open source virtualization ecosystem. And beyond that, there's some general benefits of Libvirt. Provides a stable API for managing virtualization on a host. It's not multiple host aware for something like that. You need to move up to Overt or OpenStack. But can handle all types of subsystems that are involved in virtualization. So not only managing virtual machines, but also storage on the host to support running VMs, network interfaces, networks, and so on. Additionally provides a stable API format for managing all of these entities, and a stable XML configuration format. So all of these entities, their configuration is defined by an XML specification that's extensible, and being XML, lots of tools available which are used to manipulate these things. Another nice benefit is it insulates users from underlying changes in these components. So something changes in LVM or bridge utils, or for example, you rip out a tool stack like Xen and replace it with XL and Libxl. The hope is that Libvirt will kind of make these things transparent to you. It supports secure migration protocols, and as well as or secure migration transports, I should say, and as well as a really cool series of protocols, which is right now at version 3, that allow you to do, really several steps in the migration process, from begin to prepare and so on, all the way to confirm, so that you can do error detection and rollback if necessary. As I mentioned, it integrates with lots of other subsystems, so it provides you kind of a single point through a single secure port to manage your host, and supports quite a few hypervisors. And certainly the most used ones are Xen, QEMU, KVM, and Linux containers. Just a quick graphic on the architecture of Libvirt. So on the right, we have this notion of a stateless Libvirt, where the client library talks directly via native APIs to the managed entities. This is the case for VMware, for Hyper-V, but in most cases, storage objects, network objects, other hypervisors, they require some state to be maintained about these objects. And on the left, we have the notion of stateful diagram with libvirt kind of at the center there, which maintains all the state for these various managed objects. And another thing I wanted to note is kind of down in the lower left, there's, which if you saw Stefano's talk earlier, there's two Xen drivers. So there's the old legacy Xen driver and the new driver, which is what we're working on currently upstream, the Libxl driver. So these Xen drivers, just to say a little bit more about those, interestingly, the first hypervisor supported by Libvirt was Xen. And it used what I call this kind of Uber driver, primarily focused on interaction with Xen, but also used some hypercalls and a little bit of XM if needed, and a little bit of Xen store. So really this driver kind of talked to all these components to implement its functionality. And like it says here, please do not use this thing. Xen has been removed from, it's been deprecated for several releases now. I think the last 2, it's been removed. It's not even in sources. We still have this code upstream in Libvirt. It'll probably be there for a long, long time. but prefer that folks don't use it. Certainly don't send patches unless it's some critical bug fix. Any patches for new features and that will just be rejected. All of the upstream development is now focused on the Libxl driver, and this thing supports the Libxl starting in Xen 4.2. So 4.2 and on, you're best to be using this driver. And in some cases where there's no Xen D, you can't even use the old driver. And it's always best to have the latest stable release. We have fixed quite a few bugs, both in Libvirt and Xen and Libxl over the past year or so. And many of those have been backported to the stable branches, so always best to be on the latest release, whatever it is that you're using. Since the primary purpose of Libvirt is kind of insulate you from all these type of changes on the underlying platform, a big reason, or one of the main objectives of the Libxl driver is kind of have all your existing configuration, all your existing VMs just work under this driver. So, and everything should look the same. It's accessed via the same URI. All of the domain configuration you have should just work with this new driver. It's stateful, as I mentioned on the little architecture graphic that I had. All the states maintained in Libvirt D. In the old Xen driver, most state was maintained in Xen, actually all state there. And brings me to the last comment on this slide. It's not a good idea to mix and match Libxl apps. So if you're using Libvirt to manage your Xen stack, you should use that. Not use that to create and start your VMs and then go manipulate them with XL, for example, because Libvirt would then have no idea that you went off and fiddled with this VM with another tool. So last year at the summit, one of the last slides I had was some things that we were working on, and this is a modified version of that, but just some little checks there of the things that we got completed, committed, upstream, and are actually out in a release, Libvirt, one of the releases that was done throughout the year. Libvirt's on a monthly release cycle, so if a feature doesn't make it in this one, it's only 3 to 4 weeks away, and there's another release to merge your features in. But one of the things, all of these things worked on throughout the year. Starting at the top, we didn't have support for converting XL config format to Libvirt domain XML. We kind of relied on the fact that XM configuration format could be eaten by a Libxl stack. There's a few things that aren't compatible, like in XM you could have embedded Python in your configuration where this isn't supported in XL, but for the most part the two formats are compatible and interchangeable. But there is some differences. In Libxl, or in the XL config format, the way we specify disk is much different, much more expressive. And so we didn't have support for converting that stuff last year. Excuse me. But that was work that was completed actually not long after last year's summit. Another cool feature that I worked on this past year was integration with Libvirt's lock manager. This is the lock manager service is a service that Libvirt has that you can use to protect resources against concurrent access. So, you have a shared disk that two VMs try to write to. If you're using Libvirt's lock manager service, you can say, I want to use the service. It actually supports a couple different backends. There's a virtlockd, which is an in-tree lock manager implementation in Libvirt, and also supports Sandlock, which is another project that Red Hat started. So you can configure which lock manager you want to use. You enable this thing in the Libvirt Libxl driver, and then when you start VMs, it acquires a lock on this resource and prevents you from starting another VM on that host or another host that may want to acquire this resource for write purposes. So that's a really cool feature that we got done over the year. One that we didn't get done was snapshots. This has been, lots of work has been done on this. One of my colleagues, Chun Yan, has actually been working on this on and off throughout the year. She just recently posted a version 11 of the patches. And I think that this is something that'll probably land in a 4.7 time frame in Xen. So we need the support in Libxl before we can then move up to Libvirt and implement this there. So the progress has been made, but that one's not done. Spice Graphics and QXL device, we've added support for that over the past year. Unit test, quite a bit of work done on that. One thing that has not been done that I'd really like to get done is testing the formatting and conversion path, code paths, taking domain XML and turning it into a Libxl domain config object. So, all that parsing of DOM XML into the config structure and taking a config structure and turning that into DOM XML, would really like to have some tests for that. And I have a slide to talk about a little bit of some things that are kind of needed in Libxl from my perspective to make this a little bit easier. And then I had a bullet of just your features, and throughout the year, some things have come in that we've worked on. Stefano talked about the improving the Libvirt and Xen stack to elevate the Libvirt and Xen to this Group B and ultimately Group A support in OpenStack. So a lot of work went into that throughout the year, actually just the last several months. We introduced a config file for the driver to support global or to define global behavior of the driver. So for example, do we want auto ballooning on or off? Actually, the only two things in the config file now are an auto ballooning switch and lock manager. So you can specify whether to use VertLockD or SandLock or so on. Another thing that was requested by someone at SUSE actually was support for managing domain 0. So until recently, the Libxl driver really had no clue that there was a domain 0. I kind of patterned this after the QEMU and Linux container drivers in Libvirt, where there really is no domain 0 running. But domain 0 is in fact another VM. You can balloon a thing, you can add or remove vCPUs, you can add or remove devices, and this colleague was really kind of upset that he couldn't manage his domain 0 anymore when moving to the Libxl stack, and it really was a regression from the old tool stack. So that was recently added. So some work that is in progress, not yet committed. PV-USB. Chunyan is also working on this. She recently posted a V6 of those patches. I think that these will land in 4.7 development cycle. She also has some Libvirt code based on that. Nothing's been posted to Libvirt mailing list yet. Kind of waiting for stuff to land in Xen Unstable before we start trying to push this work upstream in Libvirt. PV-SCSI, I know there's so there is no support currently in Libvirt for PV-SCSI. There is in Libxl to some extent. I'm really not sure what the progress is there. I know Olaf Herring, another colleague at SUSE, is working on some PV-SCSI related stuff, and I wanted to talk to him about the status of this before this talk, but I never did get around to it. So I'm really not sure what's going on there, but there's work to be done, I think, both on the Xen side and certainly on the Libvirt side. Snapshots, as I had mentioned on a previous slide, we're working on that. And one big patch that I'm working on, there was a similar patch done to the QEMU driver, and I think this will really improve some of the OpenStack testing, is how we lock and ref count objects within the Libxl driver. This is Libvirt only work. I posted a V2 of this work back in June, and there's been some comments on it, and I haven't got a chance to get back to that, but some really important work that will really improve the performance of the driver. We have some lock contention and so on that really slows some stuff down right now. Some improvements that are kind of on my queue or bubbling, getting close to the top. No work's been done on these yet, but I had some requests for auditing domain management operations. Libvirt has support for auditing lifecycle events of domains and resource additions and removing resources. This is implemented in a QEMU driver in Libvirt, and folks have asked for this in Xen as well. So you can see who started what VM when and where, and who added what memory to a VM and so on. Support for more migration transports. Right now, Libvirt only supports migration via clear migration channel. So some work there to use Libvirt's SSH tunnel to tunnel the data over between hosts, and ongoing work to improve migration air handling. This is a never-ending battle, really. So, things that we certainly need to be working on, and like I said, have bubbled to the top of my list, but no work's been started on these items yet. And then I have some items that, would be really nice to have. Haven't even scoped any of these out yet. And one is NUMA-related stuff. And I'm really not even sure, this next few days will be a good opportunity for me to kind of check in with the Xen community and see where things are at in the Libxl stack related to this work, but nothing's been done in Libvirt on the Libxl driver side thus far. But would like to be able to support configuration like I've shown here. So, be able to specify virtual NUMA topology for the guest. Cells, how many CPUs per cell, how much memory per cell, and as well, how that stuff is backed by the host resources. So, I want all the memory for cell ID 0 to come from node set 0, and if this can't happen, fail starting the guest. Is kind of what's expressed here. And, with our push to get Libvirt and Xen working well in OpenStack, where you often have some very large machines that, you just don't want to spew your CPUs and memory across whatever nodes, just let the hypervisor pick for me. I mean, we really want to be able to, specify these things explicitly for the guest. Memory hot plug. So we support ballooning, of course, but it would be nice to support the notion of, adding and removing memory. The QEMU driver supports this, and kind of, typical configuration looks like this that I've shown here. So when you define a VM, you say how many slots this thing has, how much, maximum amount of memory it'll ever have, and, how much memory you want to give the thing at start. So this configuration looks like, I'd want a max memory of 32 gig, 16 slots, so kind of implies, 2 gig DIMM slots. And if we want to add memory later, you handle it just like any other device. You use for SH attached device, give some little XML snippet that defines the device. And in this case, I want to add a DIMM that's another 2 gig to this thing. And, add it to node 0, for example. But like I said, none of this is supported in Libvirt currently either. And really not sure about the status of this in Libxl either.
It's working more or less. So I've used it. Hot plug memory is no problem.
And
you don't have to specify max memory. You have first to increase the maximum memory, and then you can just add some memory via XL.
Okay. So it sounds like Libxl has APIs and so on to support this. It really just needs to be wired up in Libvirt. Another one that I think this top item is Libvirt only work, maybe a little bit in Xen, but supporting OVMF and UEFI. I know that I think Wei has done work to support OVMF. What I'm not sure about is some NVRAM specification where you can then store the variables.
It doesn't work at the moment, sorry.
Right. So, well,
Roger's DM-like stuff will make this a lot easier to do.
yeah, and I mean, the top one actually can be done now in the Libvirt side, but because Libxl supports this, I just haven't got around to it. But at any rate, that's another item that we really like to make some progress on. And the CPU model and topology, kind of HVM specific, but would be nice to have some support here as well. And I think Libxl has some support for this now.
It's got some configuration for it.
Yeah.
That doesn't equate to what the VNCs, sadly.
Yeah, this would be a nice one to have for, you know, kind of the dumbing it down of normalizing CPUs and not necessarily a full-on heterogeneous environment of AMD and Intel and so on, but, you know, processors that maybe are different enough that migration without removing some features wouldn't be supported, but, you know, if we could tweak on features that are exposed to the VM, you know, would go a long way in helping migrate in such scenarios. Another nice thing the QEMU driver has that I'd like to get in the Libxl one is some QoS knobs for disk devices, network devices. You know, pretty expressive ways to specify this configuration in Libxl, but none of the stuff is wired up in Libvirt. And not sure about Xen support for random number generator device, but on these hosts where you can have, you know, many hundred VMs running, things could either, one, not have enough entropy at boot to get SSHD going or whatever, or if they're using entropy from the host, can exhaust that. So, you know, if we can pass through a device, and Libvirt supports, you know, several types of backends, so you could just use a backend from the host, like something like dev/random, or you could specify a backend there of EGD and point to an EGD source and collect information off the internet there to provide your entropy. So there's a few things which I think are not in Libxl, which I'd really like to have though. And this list kind of describes those. These are all Libxl specific things. I could make use of these in Libvirt if they were there. But improved error reporting. I do think I saw some patches for this recently. I don't know the state of those, but it's really bad right now. You know, there's tons of API calls in Libxl. We make these things in Libvirt, and it's pass or fail. So started a VM. Oh, Xen Lite failed to start this VM. Well, why? You know, there'd be countless reasons why, and some of them really simple, dumb things that you know, are really hard to determine right now with the current error reporting. You have to actually go into the log file of the driver and see what things Libxl has wrote there. And often you can get hints as to what the problem is. One thing that I've changed throughout the year, actually, you know, maybe 6 months ago, is we used to have a Libxl context in Libvirt for every domain. And it really just, code in Libvirt was kind of getting unwieldy to support this model. And Ian Jackson convinced me to, you know, move to a single context, and things have been great under that model. Code's much simpler. One downside, though, is we only have one log file now for all domains. When you create this context, you give it a stream that the library can write debug information to. And when I had a context per VM, I could say, here's a log file, var log libvirt libxl VM name.log, and life was good. Now there's some var log libvirt libxl, libxl driver.log, and everything's dumped in there. So if we could somehow come up with some way to, you know, when you create a VM, you hand Libxl some domain config objects and say, here you go. If there's some way that we could specify a per domain log file there, would really be awesome. I mean, people have already been complaining about this lack of per domain log file stuff that we had when we went with multiple Libxl contexts. Another one that I mentioned when I was talking about improved unit tests on a few slides back would be some way to compare the Libxl domain config object. So I have some domain XML. I run this through the code that converts it to a Libxl domain config object. If I could compare that with a known thing that it should look like, so I can say, yes, these are the same. We've had no regressions in the parsing code. This would be really cool. We took some stabs at this, actually. There's some methods in Libxl to convert the domain config object to a JSON document. And we had some JSON documents in the test code, and we have some XML. We say create a domain config object. Give me the JSON that corresponds to that thing, and then try to compare that to the JSON that we've had just laying around in the test directory in the tree. Problem is that, this worked fine for Xen 4.3, but you move to Xen 4.4, and there's some new objects or new data that shows up in the JSON object, and you go to compare these things, and the comparison fails because now magically there's some new thing in the JSON that you got from the config object. So I haven't looked at some ways to resolve that, but would like to talk to some folks about that this week to try to make some progress there. Really need to have tests for this. Another thing that just really drives me crazy is memory scrubbing. So no way for me to control this, right? I have some 512 gig VM, and you go to shut the thing down, and 10 minutes later, it's finally gone. All the while, the thing's been scrubbing that 512 gig of memory. That's all fine and dandy. It's cool in a secure environment, but in testing, this sucks. And if you're in a private environment, it also sucks, where you don't really care about someone looking at this memory when I bring up a new VM from a previous one. And public environments, public clouds, and so on, sure, this is great, but some knobs for controlling this would be awesome. We often get beat up, mainly from testing folks, about no screenshot API. People have gotten used to using this on the QEMU side and asked for this on Xen as well. There is some ways we fiddle with to make this work. You can look at the QEMU monitor path that Libxl created and then connect to that thing with NC or whatever and send some QMP commands to do screenshots, but having some formal API in Libxl for this would be really cool. And then last thing is support in the Xen stack for a guest agent. I'm not really sure where that's at, but it'd be really nice to have that. I mean, folks get used to some of the cool things that the guest agent provides on the QEMU side, being able to freeze a file system and do all these type of things before saving or whatever. I mean, there's resizes, there's all sorts of functionality that the guest agent gives you, and it would be really nice to have those in the Xen side as well. So my last slide is really, like most open source projects, a plea for help. If we have a really robust and featureful Libvirt plus Xen stack, that means we just have a more featureful Xen plus whatever stack. Xen plus Overt, Xen plus OpenStack, Xen plus Virt Manager, so on. And at the beginning of this talk, I said, I mentioned that I was the upstream maintainer of the Xen drivers, singular, not plural. I'm the only one, so I'm kind of a single point of failure, single point of delay, so to speak. Even my own work, right? My own work there has to sit often, wait for some other maintainers to come by, hope and pray that they take a look and review this code and hack it so I can get it in. So, even help in reviewing code or testing things and commenting there would be really helpful. And, for Libxl developers in particular, if you add something to Libxl, your new cool feature, config knob, API, whatever, stepping up the stack one layer to Libvirt and adding that there would be really much appreciated. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Any questions on Libvirt front?
So when you say you can't use the version managed on 0, is it because it's not implemented in the or is there some lacking some API?
No, it just wasn't implemented in Libvirt. I just ignored domain 0. When I first implemented this driver, looking back, don't know what I was thinking. But it was kind of, I've been working on a QEMU driver quite a bit then, there is no domain 0 in QEMU. So, I just blindly went down that path, and, it wasn't until someone kind of pointed out the obvious to me, like, hey, I used to be able to balloon domain 0 through this thing and can't any longer, that I realized, oh, wow, yeah, this was not a good decision. So Libvirt, actually the last release, Libvirt 1.2.18, includes the patches to support managing domain 0. So if you fire up Virt Manager with such a version of Libvirt, you'll see domain 0 there. You can balloon it, you can add vCPUs, you can add devices, and so on. Yep.
I was going to say, I think Toast Talk was actually Libvirt as well. I think it was pulled out, or it wasn't done when around the time they did the ACLs. If I remember, there was a problem with there was going to be a lot of ACL work.
Yeah, maybe. And in the end, there was.
I think that was what.
Yeah, and perhaps that was done. So in the end, when I went to implement this, I mean, it really, you go look at the patch, adding this, and it was quite trivial. The one thing that I did do was kind of make sure that the operation made sense, right? Because shutdown, for example. Libxl would just say, oh, sure, succeed, but nothing would happen. And so, I put some checks in there to say this operation's not supported on domain 0, but otherwise the patch was quite trivial. Anything else?
Live migration you touched on a little bit, saying that there's only a clear channel. Is there any other sort of glaring omissions or things with live migration?
No. The only...
Pretty solid?
Yeah, it's pretty solid. More testing can be done in failure cases. This is, the type of testing I've done is either induce failures or, configuration stuff. So, this VM on this host is using a bridge named, foobar, and I try to move it over to a host that doesn't even have a bridge, for example. So nothing to connect the diff to there. Those type of failure cases have been tested, but, migration is in progress, you go pull the cable on the thing and, no more data can be sent. Yeah, I haven't tested this. You want to migrate to a host that maybe the CPU's not quite identical, or there's some feature that it gives you some issue. And so on a restore, this fails on the destination. How that would be handled on the source, rollback, and so on. There's some corner cases like that need to be tested. And when I mentioned on the one slide about, migration air handling improvements, a lot of this stuff can be checked up front. So on the prepare phase, we can, from the source side, send over the configuration to the destination. And the destination can look at this stuff, pull it apart. Yeah, I can access that disk. Oh, the CPU makes sense to me. I have this much memory. I blah, blah, blah. And say, yes, we're good to go. And then the source side, you say, okay, here comes the data. So adding a little bit more logic and those type of paths could really make the thing much more solid, and more importantly, if something does go wrong, you end up in a good state, right? You have the VM running, it's doing its job on the source, not this where it failed here and we just leave it suspended or something on the source. Yeah, it looks like I'm come to a hard stop.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.